Hello and good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure and an honour to join you on your Uncharted webinar series. And I've been asked by the Dean, Saul Klein, to present something, and I'm sharing with you some work that I've been working on over the last few years on wise decision making. But it's great to be feeling I'm with Gustavson at this particular time. I have such a high regard for all the faculty and the staff in Gustavson who do such a fantastic job in integrating cross-disciplinary education with sustainability, with responsible leadership, and do it with such poise. So it's been fantastic to be working with colleagues there for the last 6 years, and now to be able to come to share with you a few highlights really on wise decision making, which is a challenge for all of us. And I guess one of the burning questions that face us often is how do we face up to really difficult, challenging decisions? And we kind of have a general idea of wisdom, but sometimes we associate wisdom with someone else, not ourselves. So perhaps the sages, the philosophers, or the great gurus that we might admire, and not so easily recognizing that we practice wisdom, but perhaps are not always recognizing that we do so. Now, one of the things you'll see in the notes in the chat room is that we're keeping the chat open, because not only is there a Q&A at the end of this session, so you can post your questions up as we go, but also I would like to ask you questions. Just a couple of questions. For example, what does wisdom mean for you? Flagging that question ready, and you can then type in the chat your answer to a couple of the questions. And I think that would be just great for all of us in this intimate little huddle over the webinar, just to share some ideas on wisdom. So if you're hopefully ready to do that, then use the chat to answer some questions as we go through. So my objective really in this short time is really, how are we going to make better quality decisions? And what does wisdom do to help us in our professional decision making, but also just the dilemmas of life? And so my hope is that we'd be able to not only look at what wisdom means and get your views, get a few other voices on what wisdom means, but also just to look at the way in which we frequently travel towards rationality and fact-based thinking as we enter areas of complexity in our lives and in our professional and personal lives. So I want us to look a little bit about rationality, but then most importantly, end with practice. What are the ways in which we can develop wisdom? I want to talk about the 5 capacities and the 3 Ps. Moving into the first question for you, ladies and gentlemen. So get into your chat. I'd be interested to know what wisdom means for you. And there is no right answer to it. I think it's always interesting to see how people comment on wisdom and how they reflect on it, because it has got something of a mystery around it. And actually, it's the most practical capacity that I think we have as people. One way of helping you answer this question might be to think of people who you think are wise. Why is it that you might admire someone for their wisdom? For example, I recently gave a talk on wisdom, again through a webinar, to a university in India. And actually there were nearly 1,000 people on this. So when I asked the question, there was a zoom of many different comments, but I was surprised at how many times mother and father featured for them as examples of people who they thought were wise. And as you're still thinking about the question, I'm looking for a few more before I read them out. Let me give you somebody who I think has demonstrated extraordinary wisdom in New Zealand. This is the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, who has really helped the country navigate some very difficult crises over the last 12 months, with the White Island eruption in December. Then there was the terrible terrorist outburst in March last year, and how she came in and has really brought the country together at these points with her wisdom and her empathy has been the thing that's been most commented on. For example, the way she actually put on a black veil when she met Muslim families who were part of this terrible tragedy of March last year. So anyway, that's an example of how I can see wisdom in a person, and then we can look at qualities such as empathy and so on, and we'll do this in a moment. So just looking at what you have said, let's just have a look at chat. Wisdom means good judgment. Yes. Inherent knowledge that helps one live life well. A combination of acquired knowledge and personal intuition. All these, I think, are true from the research that I've done. And I think what's interested in Chloe's comment there is the use of personal intuition, which is often treated with a little bit of suspicion. But when you go into the research, the way in which people use what we might call intuition or experience is quite an interesting feature in integrating, if you like, the rational approach to decision making with some other non-rational approaches. So I'm going to press on with the question of wisdom and give you some insights from some organizational psychologists, some psychologists who have studied and researched this area. Some very good friends, Professors Rooney and McKenna, have done a lot of work in this area. And they say it's the quality that shapes action in ways that are likely to lead to good judgment, good decisions, and good acts. It's associated with multitudes of positive characteristics such as ego integrity, maturity, judgment, interpersonal skills, and an exceptional understanding of life. That's the work. That was one of many summaries by Monica Ardelt, who's done a lot of research in wisdom in relation to age, actually. Then Chia Holton Yuan is not a skill or a talent. And that's where I think we get confused, because we can often associate wisdom. Isn't that to do with knowledge? Well, of course, it's a means of using knowledge, but it's got more than just the skill or the talent. It is associated with who we are and how we act, rather than the knowledge we possess. And Professor Balters and Staudinger say it's expert knowledge in the pragmatics of life. So for them, expressing the way in which we have to make decisions and exercise a capacity to make decisions well. Here's one that I really like from a friend called Dr. Mark Strong, and he says it's reading the patterns of life well and applying these with insight. Applying these with insight. So talking about background to wisdom, I'm just putting up there the Chinese character Zhi. And that's because I think we need to see that wisdom is a cross-cultural dimension. If I had time, we can look at some Indian examples of wisdom. Different cultures and groups have different expressions of wisdom. In China, Zhi is really associated with the virtues, the combination of Ren and Yi, which is, if you like, benevolence and righteousness or rightness. And it's all to do with the way in which you relate to others, how you reciprocate to others. Here's one comment on that word Zhi, or that character Zhi. Without virtuous behavior, even if one is incredibly knowledgeable, one cannot be considered wise. And when you think about that, the association of virtue, or if you like, values or ethics or integrity, is part of wisdom, insofar as, you know, you might have somebody who's very knowledgeable, very intelligent, and very expert in their field, and could be respected for that. But that alone doesn't necessarily give you the task of wisdom if that's not accompanied by some basic values. So somebody who's proud and arrogant or boastful might also be very knowledgeable, but not necessarily perceived as wise, because we kind of impute an ethical dimension to the idea of wisdom and Zhi. And this is definitely the case in Confucian philosophy, but also if we look briefly at Greek philosophy, phronesis, which is one of many Greek words actually for wisdom. It's actually practical wisdom. It's the practice of using wisdom in difficult situations. Sophia is another one, which is a sort of transcendent, almost spiritual wisdom, different forms of understanding of wisdom. And in fact, Aristotle was masterful at saying that, you know, what the heroic person needs to be is this combination of having a sense of the transcendent, but is also extremely practical and earthly. Now, moving on to complexity and rationality, it's the world in which we live. The business world is complex, and we're in a business school right now, which is facing complex decisions as we look at the COVID-19 crisis. There aren't going to be enough spaces to keep everybody social distancing. What do we do? It's a challenge. And so decision making is complex. But when I think about this, actually, is it not also the case that life is complex, actually? For all of us, decision making is difficult. And one of the ways this is expressed is, and this I can tell you is a technical term, the wicked problem. And the wicked problem has many different dimensions, but no clear solutions. And of course, we can think of the COVID crisis right now as being an example of a wicked problem. Many different ways in which we're trying to solve it, but this is a really difficult problem. And interestingly, Professor David Dunn at the school at Gustavson has done some work on design thinking as an approach to solving wicked problems. So if you want to ask more about wicked problems, I'm sure that David would be happy to answer those questions. But wicked problems are an opportunity for us to say, well, you know, sometimes we haven't got the facts, but we need some other anchors to come at a problem, even if it's just defining it, giving some clarity as much as we can to complexity. Wicked problems are unpredictable, they're uncertain, there are no obvious sort of right routes through. We can have all the data, but we don't, how do we use that? So wicked problems, whether you can think right now in your own life of a wicked problem or not, there are problems. And our first solution is often, and absolutely the right and obvious thing is to look at it with our brains and our knowledge and our rational approach. You know, fact-based thinking, hard data, making sure we use scientific methodology so that there's objectivity, that there is proper reasoning process, that we are trying to cut out and reduce bias in order to reach a solution. Have we got the right data? Making sure that we're using a rational approach. Now, this is dominant, particularly in the Western world, not so clear actually in other cultures, but we in the West feel safe and secure when we ensure that certain boxes are ticked in relation to rationality, and all that is true. And of course, one would not be wise if one didn't use some of those features. But is it everything? Is that it in terms of complex questions? Let me give you an example of something that I saw in McKinsey's journal recently. They were advising CFOs on how they might plan for uncertainty. Seems a difficult one to get your mind, or certainly a wicked problem, planning for uncertainty. And of course, the article was full of great advice for CFOs, knowledge and so on. There's some snippets there of the 5 steps that the article unfolds in good detail. Of course, we need to have the financial data, a proper fact base from which we build scenarios. We then identify the trigger points to adjust to different market scenarios. Now, look at where I've ringed a couple of words there: scenarios, trigger points. Data in and of itself, and even a rational approach, will only get you so far. So rational approaches can come up with options, could come up with scenarios, but will that necessarily result in a judgment? In the end, we have to make judgments based on data, based on the trigger points. We have to adapt forecasts. So even in an article that is solid and hard on rationality, implicit in making a judgment for a CFO in determining best actions is something above and beyond just the data that is faced. So objectivity is critical to this. Now, open up your chat, because I've got a question for you on this matter of of rationality. Now, the question there I'd like you to think about is words that you might use to describe someone who overtakes you at 80 in a 60 limit. Just think quite quickly, someone's just bombing past you, way past the speed limit, and they're overtaking you at 80 and it's a 60 limit. Now, if you're quick and you can give us on your chat right now, a few words that might, nice words coming up: jerk, dangerous jerk, reckless, etc. Even if you haven't typed them, I want you to think about how you would describe could cause an accident. Interesting, the use of the word jerk and reckless is, in my experience, commonly you ask this question around and you get some quite colourful language. When we ask this question, we all feel this is, crazy, lunatic, dangerous, reckless, jerk, etc. Just change the question slightly. The question I want you to answer now is words that I might use to describe myself when I'm overtaking 80 in a 60 limit. You don't have to share your answers to that, but have a think. So the people that are reckless and are jerks, are dangerous, they're going to cause an accident. Is that you, if you're in that situation? Or do you let's say, well, look, I didn't know. I didn't know I was in a 60 limit. I wasn't doing 80. I was just overtaking. Anyway, I was in a rush. I had to get to a hospital appointment to, and if I missed that, it would be very serious. I had to do this. So there are often ways in which the way we frame our self-image, these kind of questions affect our objectivity. So the point of this is simply to say that when one comes to rationality, there is questions of objectivity, and what we call that technically are interferences between, your potential and what happens when biases, confirmatory biases, when we look for data that confirms what we think, biases that are about ourselves and how we look when we're making a decision. These are all biases. And I asked questions a few years ago when I was in Shanghai. I asked we surveyed 182 senior business executives, 21 countries. We had 18,000 words back. It was a qualitative study. Two simple questions. What does wisdom mean for you? What does it add to the decision-making process? A few snapshots from that survey that might be interesting. These are all business people. They were senior C-suite owners. This is one. A person is a kind, high morality, a mixture of different intangible things such as character, values, intuition, the combination of rational with intangible elements, which goes back to the point that was made earlier about intuition, perhaps. Not just rational facts or knowledge, says the director of a South American Coffee Grower Association, but also the ability to understand the context and the potential allies and opponents and the sensitivities to implement a project. So the top lines from this survey, and I can give you details of where you can get more, but essentially we found that in the responses that we had, there seemed to be the idea that wisdom has got an integrating capacity, bringing both perceptual characteristics as well as the other more normal, if you like, rational characteristics into managerial decision making. It also helps us to interpret and read the context for a decision. When we have the facts, but we may challenge the facts, or we may not have all the facts, but we need to interpret what we have in making a decision. We need to be sensing in terms of the way in which other people might respond to a decision and be strong on our other awareness. Now, in summary, after we looked at all this data and looked at other research papers, we kind of developed these five wise capacities. There's nothing particularly new in these, and if you look at different researchers, you'll find that whether it's cognitive ability or cognitive affective or emotional dimensions to wisdom, they kind of fit somewhere within these five wise capacities. So we have rational capability, as discussed, give me the data, give me knowledge, give me the scientific approach to answering a challenge, the application of knowledge using objectivity. Then there's perceptivity, our perception, the way in which we bring other insight and intuition that might be regarded as experience. Sometimes it is just accessing experience, or having I have to say, gut feeling was one of the words that came out a number of times from our respondents. They talked about this sense, this instinct. Now, there is a whole lot of work on what is that instinct, what is gut instinct, but it's not rational. It's not saying here's the rational approach, it's non-rational. The other thing that came through strongly is ethical skill. We find that the ability to integrate both empathy, especially the ability to really understand others, and also integrity, honesty with consistency in behavior, were really important features that came from the study. And then pragmatism, the ability to be practical in applying knowledge about a circumstance to solving a situation. And perhaps most importantly, managing ourselves, managing our ego, and keeping our ego in check so that there's an objectivity and our ability to put other people ahead sometimes of our own interests. Now, that's a tricky one, and you might have some questions in a moment on that. But typically, and I can't go into a lot of detail, but here's one that I ran recently, a question on how you take all those 5 capacities in addressing a company's challenges in the COVID-19 pandemic. A situation where forecast revenues for this engineering consulting business were falling to the figures you can see on the right. We have to cut the salary bill. We want to avoid redundancies. What are the options? How do we do it? And in a situation like this, you find that all 5 of those capacities are needed in seeking to address what might seem to be, well, isn't this just a question of just looking at the numbers, which of course it is. But the way in which that process is managed isn't going to be just the numbers alone. It's going to be a mixture of using ethical skill, pragmatism, managing one's own emotions in terms of the effects that it has on oneself. So I just want to conclude with giving you the 3 Ps of being wisdom conscious, if you like, when you make decisions, and conscious that I'm racing through this, but let me give you the 3 Ps. The first is your presence, your self-awareness, managing your ego, and the way in which you demonstrate care towards the interests of others. So it's complementary rather than competitive thinking in using your presence in a situation. And here's a quote by Tony Schwartz talking about how the highest challenge we all face is doing the right thing, especially when it doesn't necessarily serve our immediate self-interest. The second is poise, that in a situation of challenge and complexity, we have to resist being reactive. We need to be open about the tensions that are there in the decision-making process and feel those and have a degree of distance between the situation that we're dealing with and where we sit as in our role in helping people through that challenge. And finally, the third P, practice, that there is a way in which we can practice alternative ways of approaching decision making by using and experimenting creatively with our insights, our experiences, and our senses, sometimes testing ourselves to say, well, this is what I feel, I'm going to do this, and then to record what happens when you followed your gut instinct, when you perhaps didn't have time to go through the full rational approach. And I'm certainly not talking about major decisions, but certainly there are ways in which we can start practicing the listening, if you like, to our own instincts, as well as managing facts, data, and reasoning with colleagues and other stakeholders. So using the 5 capacities, having the 3 Ps in order to face our complex world and to develop our capabilities that we all have to navigate is critical. Now, over to you for questions. I'm going to just see on the Q&A whether in fact we have any questions. I can't see any, so if there isn't, then I've got one that I'd like to ask myself. I'm not sure that I've got the answer, but you touch Q&A if you've got a question and you enter it into the question box. One question I'm often asked is, do you get wiser as you get older? You know, there's an assumption that surely older people are going to be wiser than younger people. And I've looked at different research on this, and there was a particular piece of research by Monica Ardelt, who looked at this, and she and her team were unable to conclude an answer. There was difficulty in looking at a formulation that showed a relationship between age and wisdom. And what she felt was more likely the case was that those that were sensitive to wisdom and sensitive to ethics and were seeking to develop themselves over time in their life probably did become wiser. Couple of questions. It takes time to become an effective leader with practical wisdom, but for some, so easy to fall from this leadership pedestal. Based on your experience and research, what are the top 2 common themes why leaders fail? Wow, that is a mighty question. And I'm quickly thinking through about 182 responses in the research that we carried out on how wisdom adds to decision making. And also an interesting piece of work by Professor Robert Sternberg, who talked about why is it that smart people can be so foolish. And notice he uses the word smart, not wise. But in his work, he was saying that actually one of the big barriers to being wise and developing as an effective leader is having a wrong appreciation of yourself. And I can't remember his technical term for this, but it was, you know, a sense of omniscience. I'm all knowing, or I'm all powerful. An over projection of one's ego. So there is a massive gap between the projected person and the real person inside, working very hard to project an image. And he gave examples, and well, perhaps won't quote the examples because it might be a bit embarrassing to public figures, but he in his paper talks about people who we might think are well known and how they've fallen on their sense of their bigness, their omniscience, or their all-powerfulness. I've got a couple of minutes to go. Could you comment on making decisions as a group? For example, a group of community leaders. That's really a neat question, because of course everybody has a sense of their own wisdom, and I think the key is to have a facilitator that is able to be objective and to ensure that, if you like, the 5 capacities that I referred to earlier are all encouraged to have voice. In other words, in a conversation, community leaders, one might say, look, on our agenda, ladies and gentlemen, we would like to ensure we practice wisdom. So we might go around the table and say, you know, what do we all think wisdom is ahead of our conversation? What are the things we should be looking out for in wisdom? Now, I'm sure some of the 5 capacities will come out. We need knowledge, we need rational approach. We also need to bear our experiences. We need to think about other people in terms of empathy and so on. So I would hope that in a conversation like that, a possibility of even talking about what wisdom might mean in the decision-making process ahead of the agenda would be a good place to start. Henri Claude de Bettigny, can parents facilitate the emergence of development of wisdom in their children? Wow. I guess all of you here who've got children or grandchildren, in Henri Claude's case, might know the answer to that better than myself. I'm a father of 4. And I can say there is certainly mystery in the development of children and wisdom. And I was interested that in India, how many respondents look to their mother and their father as being sources of wisdom. And I immediately thought, well, at what age does your child need to be before they recognize that you're wise? But that's not answering the question, which is, I think the development of wisdom in their children has clearly got to be our example, hasn't it? And again, the 5 capacities are useful in a balancing that we're not just seeing to be always rational in our responses, though we need that, but we're able to use ethical skill by asking, well, what is the right thing to do to challenges that children might face in their relationships to others? For example, how do they respond to others? Well, you know, having time with them where you can create a distance from the situation, and thinking in your own mind about, you know, the balance between rationality, between the pragmatic the pragmatics of a situation and the perceptions of your insight, your experience, are all part of, I think, the conversation that we have with children as they develop. So again, I think just talking about wisdom with children and bringing your own sense of wisdom and history is a really important, critical point. Can you talk about emotion and its role in wisdom and decision making? Yes, a lot of research has been done on this question of emotional regulation, and there's some neuroscientific work done on different neuroscientific patterns that we all have, and therefore the challenges that some have in managing emotions are different. We're all very differently emotionally made up. And the chief thing we need to be able to understand, I think, is understanding well our own emotions, our vulnerabilities. And that requires a degree of self-awareness. And one of the characteristics of wisdom is self-awareness. It's part of ethical skill. It's the ability to have good extra relationships, as well as intrapersonal relationships, extrapersonal relationships, a knowledge of oneself, a knowledge of your emotional makeup, and therefore your vulnerabilities and how best to manage those emotions, such that when you are in it, you need to know that you're in the right position in your emotions before going into a decision-making process. And there has to be a distance, I think, between oneself and one's emotions and a decision that is before us to make. Final question, then I think we'll have to sign off. It's 8:29, or 12:29 your time. When the majority agreed on the right thing to do, how would the leader persuade them to do the wise thing? Wow. I think always in those situations, one has to respect a majority view for what it is, even if one may not always think it's the wisest thing. Depending on the context, of course, and your role in that debate, whether you're if you're the leader, then you've got an added responsibility to challenge. And one of the challenges of a leader is to bring alignment. And alignment doesn't necessarily mean everybody agrees, but sometimes the leader has to know the tone to set and when to override what the majority approve, and you can't do that too many times, and when you have to restrain that. So it's a mixture of, again, balancing one's own instinct, gut instinct to a situation with the knowledge of the people that you have, which comes down to this matter of ethical skill, the ability to read people, self-awareness, and to have the sensitivity to know when you can put your voice and say, actually, you really think this is the wrong thing to do. Chief thing is always to be honest and to be open.